It's time to get your music radio ready with the Audio Skills Podcast. It doesn't matter what type of music you're creating or what gear you use. It's all about the technique. Get ready to turn your home studio into a place where your music goes platinum. Now give it up for your host, Scott Hawksworth.
Hey everyone, Scott here with you for another episode of the Audio Skills Podcast. And in this week's episode, we're going to be covering part one of a two-part series on something that is so crucial to getting a radio-ready mix, and that is mixing vocals. And I'm really excited as well because joining me to cover this will be David Donaldson, a Grammy-winning producer and composer. But before I get into all of that, I wanted to begin with our audio tip of the week. And of course, every week on the podcast, I like to give our listeners a key takeaway, much like I do with our tutorials on audioskills.com or on our YouTube channel. So for this week's tip, I want to talk about vocal mixing tip, but it's one that could really apply to any kind of track, any instrument. And the tip is this: resist the temptation to only solo the vocal to make your compression or EQ changes. Now, the fact is that when you're mixing, you are trying to paint a sonic picture and make all of your tracks fit together and sound awesome. So if you're only EQing or compressing when you hit that solo button, then you will have no concept of how your moves are fitting into the rest of the mix. And context is so important because when someone's listening to your music, they aren't going to be listening to your vocal in solo mode. They're going to be listening to your vocal with the rest of the tracks around it. So why would you only mix with just the vocal soloed? Now, some people will take this a step further and they might say that you should never EQ, for example, in solo. Now, I stop short of saying that. Again, there's different philosophies when it comes to mixing, but I stop short of saying you should never use solo mode. I think you can absolutely use a solo mode for the vocal, and you absolutely should consider doing that, especially if you really want to dial in and work on some more specific issues and really get in there with your EQ, for example. But I think you should also constantly be checking it in context with the rest of the mix. If there's a bottom line to all of this, though, it's to do both as needed, and especially avoid just working on a vocal exclusively in solo because you're going to forget that context and it's not going to serve your mix. So now we're going to move on to our interview this week, and joining us is going to be David Donaldson, who's going to help us chat about mixing vocals and producing vocals specifically, and I'm so excited to introduce him. He's a music producer and composer who has worked in audio for over 17 years, and in 2005, he won a Grammy Award for producing and engineering the soundtrack for the movie Ray, so obviously he knows a thing or two when it comes to music. David, welcome, and thanks so much for joining us today, man.
Thanks for having me here, Scott.
How's your spring been going? How are things over in Scotland?
It's it just rains, and then good weather here is not raining.
Yeah, that sounds about right. At least from what I've seen of Scotland, I have not had the pleasure of actually visiting there yet.
Yeah, I'm quite sure Scotland's music scene owes a lot to people just being forced to find things to do indoors.
For sure. So sort of to get us started, we're talking about mixing vocals, and this is something that I think a lot of people, the vocal, especially in recorded music with pop or rock or anything like that, is really so important to get right. And so my first question is, when it comes to adding compression to vocals, there are a lot of opinions out there about compressing them. A lot of people are like, oh, you can compress them too much and absolutely kill their dynamics or not enough, and so on. How do you approach compressing vocals? And do you have any kind of tips or advice for using compression on a vocal successfully?
I would say, I was sort of brought up in the British school. I don't know if this is still a thing, but when we were being taught, there was a sort of the two types with the British style and the American style. The British was much more about getting your settings set on outboard and just recording exactly what you're hearing, like putting to tape what you're processing, as it were. And the American style, as we were taught, was much more, have that more on the monitor path and record without it. The obvious reason for that would be to, not to overcompress. I mean, if you're overcompressing a signal and that's what you've got on tape or on disc, that's it. It's done. You can't take it off. I would say these days I kind of have a hybrid approach. I compress a little bit going in. I use the Warm 76, the clone of the 1176 by Warm Audio, which is one of those ones I would say people starting out, if you were looking to buy your first compressor, that's just a no-brainer. It's just awesome. I mean, it's got to the point where it kind of lives pretty much on my input channel all the time now. I use that partly just to kind of, I suppose, really catch the really dynamic sections of a vocal. And obviously I'm talking about recording, but, I imagine people out there, it is a question of recording and mixing. And I do see them they definitely have a role in both. And obviously compression originally was just to get the vocal up to the level where you can kind of hit the nice spot on tape. These days, using digital recorders, it's not, you don't have that issue anymore. So you can record a lot quieter than you used to be able to, really no problems. I would advise anybody to kind of, if you get a setting on an outboard compressor you really like, then, put it to tape. I would say for people starting out, I would sort of make sure you're under compressing, if anything, going in. As I said, like if it's on and you can't take it off, then, it really does tie your hands later on in the mix process. I would say when it comes to actually compressing in the mix, I would always advise people to kind of favor automation over compression. I mean, a lot of this is just about making sure the vocal is kind of loud enough against the backing track, if you like. And I think a lot of people, when they start out, just use compress and think there should be one setting that would make your vocal work all the way through the track. I would say that's one of the commonest errors I see, is people think, right, I've compressed my vocal, that's it, done. And I think a lot of what people look for in compression can be achieved by automation.
Just using some volume automation, things like that. Yeah, I mean,
if you've got your vocal recorded clean and there's no distortion and you haven't overcompressed, these days you've got ample time and opportunities to fix it in terms of dynamics against whatever's going on musically in the track without resorting to absolutely hammering a vocal with compression. I do say, I agree, overcompressing a vocal is a no-no outside of it being a particular effect you're trying to achieve. I definitely think having a sort of more of a breathing dynamic in a vocal is much more enticing and a lot less wearing on the listener. In the context of one track, fair enough. But if you're talking about an album and people listening to, a lot of music, I think when your thing comes along and it's overcompressed, it just wears your ears out. I think it's like people trying to win with volume rather than sort of seducing people to kind of sometimes, lean in a little bit. A good starting point, for instance, say on the 1176, it used to be known as I think it's still known as the 10-2-4 method.
10-2-4 method?
Yeah. You set the attack to 10 o'clock, you set the release to 2 o'clock, and you set the ratio to 4. That was known as a kind of like 10-2-4. It's a really good kind of starting point. Outside of that, I mean, you'll know yourself that there's no one setting that's going to work for everything.
Every vocal is different.
Absolutely. And there's no rule that says you have to use just one compressor. There's a number of times I find myself using two compressors, both sort of doing something slightly different. One maybe just to kind of bring the vocal up in general, and then one maybe later on, a little more in a kind of almost limiting role, that sort of much higher sort of ratio. And these days, it's not like you have to go out and buy another 10 units. You just fling in another compressor plug-in. And it's a question of, when it's really a question of learning the sound, and that just comes from listening to, if you like, professionally produced records, then just trying to emulate it yourself. And I do think, a little goes a long way in compression with vocals for me. Don't really like hearing them absolutely hammered. I really like to hear them kind of move and breathe. So I would say that's kind of my sort of take on that is kind of, especially when you're starting out, is underdo it rather than overdo it. That there is a temptation, people just trying to push things as hard as they can volume wise, sort of short circuits a better path.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a really great philosophy, especially for those of you guys out there who might be just starting out. Much better to undercompress than overcompress. So kind of moving on to my next question, this is kind of the next big tool that people use when maybe mixing a vocal, EQing vocals. And this can be very, very helpful dealing with any kind of issues or helping vocals fit better in a mix or whatever your goal might be. And, obviously there are a few EQ moves that I personally feel are good to take in general, such as, roll off that unwanted noise below, 75 to 100 hertz or something like that. Do you have any EQ moves that you find you often make with vocals, and if so, what kind of frequencies do you frequently find yourself, I really like tackling this?
As you say, that's a tricky one. It is a lot like the kind of compression one, and it must be so frustrating for people starting out. It's like, just tell me the answer, and and it's really not. It's not people.
Again, every vocal is different, right? So
it's not like people are going, I'm not telling everybody my special frequencies. It really, really does come down to every single vocal requires, and even different songs with the same singer require different EQ profiles, and again that also changes in combination with what's going on in the track. If I had to kind of say there was one that, or maybe two that I would kind of go for, one of which you mentioned is making sure there's nothing rumbly going on there. Sub-frequencies that aren't meant to be there are, you do need to get rid of them. I'm not suggesting you just low cut absolutely everything going on your track. The other ones that I suppose that's just kind of favor, I've got a couple of mics and they tend not to be that hyped. There's a lot of kind of hyped, high-end accentuated mics out there. And I kind of favor the slightly darker ones or the sort of flatter ones on a kind of basis of, I've found that for me, that gets me through just about anything. The more, if you like, interesting or unique a microphone sound profile is, the more it kind of tends to favor one vocal over another. And that's great if you've got a lot of money to buy a lot of really nice mics. Again, if you're starting out, I kind of favor the sort of the flatter, if you like, almost boring ones. So if there's anything I kind of maybe reach for a little bit EQ wise, it's on the highs, I would say. I got there's the clariphonic EQ. Don't know if you guys have run into that. It's kind of like a parallel compressor and it's super cool on high frequencies. It gives you that presence without being harsh. I would say that's probably one of my go-tos. I really like the mag EQ with the air setting on that, like, setting frequencies well above on the plugin. It's saying like we're targeting frequencies at the kind of like 20, 30, but obviously the slope on that EQ comes down into the kind of listening and audible frequencies. And I do tend to kind of, I would say usually a little bit of that will go on at some point. But other than that, if it's, if the track's really kind of mid and bass heavy, then you're going to end up either having to kind of cut into the track or you're going to have to kind of boost the vocal where the track's not to get it to fit. It's going to be a compromise between those two situations.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So kind of speaking of EQ, there are always people who fall into, they can be in multiple schools. Some favor additive EQ with, really liking to boost things now and then. Others favor sort of a subtractive EQ and they're like, no, I just want to cut things. And then still more obviously say, hey, there's a mix. Sometimes you boost, sometimes you cut. Where might you say you fall philosophically when it comes to EQ? And this can be with vocals or just in general.
I would say I'm a cut first, boost later man. Cutting first. And this took me the longest time to learn. Certainly when I started out, it was like, hey, we can boost this. And it's more fun to boost things. It really is. I remember that, but it causes a lot more trouble than cutting. Cutting is the harder thing to learn. And it's the thing I would suggest anybody starting out really sort of focus on first. It's like if you, somehow this, people want to sort of hear more of this, so they want to hear the vocal cut through, so they grab the high EQ and they boost that and they go, right, that's cool. And then they kind of maybe go, actually, I want it to be more authoritative, and they boost some of the lows, and you just end up boosting all over the place. And you kind of lose, if you like, it's almost like having a band in the back of the studio. Everyone's going, I want the drums up, and the singer goes, I want the vocal up. And, you can actually look at the vocal and it's almost like the frequencies. It's going, I want this up, I want that up. And it's much better to learn to cut things first before you kind of boost. Partly it can just be corrective. There can just be things you're hearing. And that's, actually for me applies more to recording things other than vocals, ringing tones and resonances that you just think that needs, that needs gone, or it needs to be really, really reduced. You can't boost your way out of those problems. So I would definitely cut first, boost later. I tend to cut more on tighter cues, a much narrower focus, and the boosts do tend to be sort of broader. My cut EQs are always not linear phase. Get in about the cutting with just a kind of zero latency, non-linear EQ. Those kind of hard cuts and sometimes even boosts on a linear EQ are going to potentially cause you kind of pre-ringing problems. And then if you want a sort of linear phase EQ for sort of more gentle boosting on wider cues, have that coming after. I mean, for instance, when we talk about vocals, the first thing to reach for, of course, isn't even the EQ. It's where the mic sits in front of any sound source. If you can try and fix it there, it's going to take you longer, and it's going to involve you sometimes walking back between different rooms and experimenting. But that's the place to fix it. If your vocal's too bassy and they're on a cardioid mic, get them to come back off the mic a bit. You want a little bit more bass on certain parts, get them to come into the mic a little bit. You get that bass tipping boost from a cardioid mic, where it's just a feature of how the cardioid pattern works. There's a lot about that I would say is in almost, if you are either the singer, learning yourself, or if you work with singers, kind of taking the time to kind of work with them and sort of train them in that, in that sort of microphone technique.
Absolutely. I mean, that's something that I try to harp on, and probably I sound like a broken record sometimes, but I say the idea of getting it right at the source, because if you can make a change in the recording process, you're going to save yourself some time and headache later in the mixing process. And David, that's just such a great point.
I know what you're saying. You feel like you're just someone's dad, just nagging all the time. Like, take the time to go and do it in the real world first, because it's more than just fixing things. I think that route genuinely allows you to actually capture things that you won't be able to get with EQ later. There's a change in the sound that I personally would struggle to recreate. I would much rather work with my singer and get them sort of moving right, as it were.
Right. So no amount of, boosting could get you, if you were trying to get a better bass response or something like that, could get you quite the same quality or what have you, as moving someone.
I believe that very, very strongly. I mean, that's not to say you will obviously get a boosted lower end if you boost it in EQ, but if you get them moving into the mic better, it's kind of more natural, and it brings in sound that I've never been able to kind of I can correct these things, but it's almost like you can't quite create them. It's definitely, again, if you've got the time to learn and you've got the time with a singer, it's worth an hour of your session just to kind of sit and work through them.
Absolutely. So aside from tone quality, which, that's kind of inherent in the vocal, from a production standpoint, in your opinion, David, what separates a great sounding vocal from one that is just okay, that is just good?
Are we talking purely sound quality, or are we talking performance?
I might say sound quality. Performance, that's one of those things that, every performer might be different. But in terms of sound quality, especially like, let's say you're working on a vocal and you're trying to say, okay, I want to take this from good to great or what have you. When you listen to one, what sort of separates that?
Oof, that's a tricky one.
I'm coming with the heat here.
I do find it quite hard, personally, to kind of draw really, really hard lines between these. That's why I kind of asked if it's about the performance. I think probably the most useful thing to sort of talk about here in recording a vocal, outside of what microphones and compression using is, and probably even more important than all those things when you're starting out, is the space you're recording in. If you've got a good space, then your vocal is going to sound better, and it's going to free you up to try more things. I mean, if you're in if you're recording in a bathroom and that works, there's any number of great vocals on great tracks that have been recorded in a stairwell in a studio. A bathroom can give you an amazing kind of reinforcement of a voice. Those sort of things are, they're almost serendipitous. It's like, it's pure luck that worked on the day with that track, with that person. But if you can kind of create a space for yourself to work and I would kind of verge on the dead side, not reflective, not reverberant. If you can kind of create a space in your working environment, be it in your booth or another room or a section of your room that you work in, $500 worth of absorbent material well placed is going to make such a difference. Like, I mean, such a difference. You know, like I was talking about, if you want somebody to move on and off the mic, then if you're in a really reverberant room, they move off. Yeah, it's going to get, it's going to thin out a little bit. That the bass is going to drop off. But you're going to bring in the room. You're going to end up with this kind of almost sounding like you've got the singer in two different spaces. So that's what I'm saying. If you've got a kind of a good space to work in, it allows them to move and work with a mic, and allows you to kind of try different mic set positions that, you know, if you are in a kind of really, really kind of tiled, say, wooden floored room with bare walls, you just can't do. Having the kind of, you are recording the room as well as the voice. So if you've got the wrong space captured, again, it's really, really hard to get rid of that.
Right. Once it's in the recording, it's in there.
And then, you know, if you're going to compress that or hammer the vocal later, that room's going to come up too. It's going to get worse. So when you're recording that, if you like that room that you don't want, that right there at that moment is as good as it's getting. It's only going to get worse for you in the mix. So really, really kind of take some time to kind of make sure the space you're working in is good enough. And obviously, you know, not everybody starts out with two rooms to work in. My first place was just it was a walk-in cupboard, and I had things set up, and I, used the bedroom, which had a carpet, which helped letting things down. You know, everybody starts out, I know people don't have these sort of opportunities, but a little bit of money spent putting things up on your walls, even if it's, even at the kind of mat, putting up a blanket and, using 2 mic stands to kind of drape things around the vocal, it makes a huge difference. I can't emphasize that enough.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned things like blankets or, I mean, even for me, using some pillows or something like that. One thing I do when I record vocals, because I don't have a completely treated space, I'll use acoustic shield and I'll have my microphone there, and then I'll take a blanket and kind of put it over there. So I'm kind of under the blanket, and just another way to try to help deaden some of that and kind of keep some of those reflections or things that you might not want getting picked up in the performance out of there.
Exactly. I mean, I work with this girl. She's kind of part-time student here, and then she goes back home. And when she's back home, her parents have obviously got a bigger house, and her mum's got a walk-in cupboard full of her clothes, and that is a phenomenal sounding space. You just got, so you can. Sometimes it's just about kind of maybe negotiating with other people who've got, if you've got a walk-in cupboard and there's clothes up, that's a good place to start. Yeah, it's cheap, but even the solutions you're saying are cheap compared to all the amount of money most people spend on all the other equipment. It's always the last thing people think about, and it kind of should be really at the top of the list.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So sort of moving on here, sibilants and plosives. So those hard S sounds, and then, some of those hard consonants, P, T, K, for those who might be unfamiliar. They can be difficult for some producers to tackle, and they can be frustrating. In a general sense, David, how do you approach addressing those or fixing any issues with those? Is it as simple as, hey, I just throw a de-esser on there and I'm done with it? Or do you kind of make other kinds of moves?
It used to be a de-esser, pretty much slapped on it. And then sometimes in combination with a little bit of automation on the actual vocal. What I used to do was sometimes have a channel set up with a de-esser channel without, and then just as simple as kind of chopping out the bits of audio with the problems and sort of sticking them across onto this other channel. Recently, like in the last couple of years, one of this touches on that workshop I did with you. That is my go-to these days. That for me still represents the best I've ever had it, of splitting the track into tonal and atonal elements on RX Advanced. And then you have all these things separated out. It's phenomenal amounts of control. Interestingly enough, since that tutorial we did, I noticed Eventide have brought out an effects unit that separates tone and transients.
Oh, wow. Cool.
I've got a strong feeling this is probably the way plugins are going to be moving in the next 10 years. I think we'll see an awful lot more of that coming in. But this is a chance to kind of jump in ahead. That for me, having your vocal separated out into all your S's, atonal stuff, just sitting on another channel that combines together with the original one to make the full voice is incredible. The amount of control you can get. The other one again, this seems like I don't want to. It sounds like I'm kind of saying just throw money at a plugin and it gets it done. Revoice Pro is really good at it as well. You can actually just go in and actually pull down the level of anything that pretty much doesn't have tone. It's almost like a slightly more workflow efficient way of doing it. That's something people should kind of check out. If it's really something you're struggling with, being able to just go into the vocal on that one, and it's pretty much highlighted for you. You grab it, you pull the level down, it constantly plays the sound that you're taking down, so you can kind of get an audio reference of where it's sitting. That, I have to say, that's been a bit of a revelation in the last couple of months for me.
Absolutely. And just a reminder for those of you listening, David did join us on audioskills.com for a workshop, and he went over exactly how he uses some of these tools he's been talking about here to really get some vocals that give him added control over them. So it's pretty fantastic to see. All right. So that is going to wrap things up for our show and our discussion with David for this week. In fact, David had so many good tidbits of info and advice on mixing vocals that I thought it would be worth having 2 whole episodes on it. So be sure to tune in next week where we'll cover part 2. In the meantime, I wanted to thank David for joining me, and if you'd like to learn more about his work, you can visit his site at constructmusic.com. Thank you so much for listening today, and for links and information about today's show and our guest, please check out our show notes at audioskills.com/podcast.
Ready to go even deeper with your recording, mixing, and music production? We've got all the info and techniques you need in one place so you can turn it up. Go to audioskills.com and access a huge library of video tutorials and private workshops so you make progress even faster. Come back next week for a brand new episode of the Audio Skills Podcast.